The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, cutting through the peaceful silence of my living room, where I'd been wrapping Emma's final gift. The caller ID showed my granddaughter's name, but the voice that came through was barely recognizable, a whispered sob mixed with chattering teeth and pure terror. "Grandma Maggie, please, he locked me out. It's so cold. I can't feel my fingers." I was already reaching for my coat before Emma finished the sentence. 40 years as an emergency room nurse had trained me to respond to crisis calls with immediate action, but hearing my granddaughter's voice breaking with cold and fear sent a surge of protective rage through my veins that I hadn't felt since the night her parents died 15 years ago. "Emma, where are you right now? Are you hurt?" "I'm on Derek's front porch, in my nightgown. Grandma, it's negative 10 degrees, and he won't let me back inside. I tried to call an Uber, but my phone is dying and I don't have my wallet. Stay on the line with me, sweetheart. I'm driving to you right now. Keep moving to stay warm." I grabbed my emergency medical kit from the hallway closet, a habit from decades of nursing that had never left me even in retirement, and headed to my car. The roads were treacherous with ice and snow, but I'd driven through worse conditions during my years responding to emergency calls. Grandma, I think I made him really angry. At dinner, he was talking about poor people who take advantage of family charity and looking right at me when he said it. I told him that wasn't fair because I work full-time and pay my own way. Then he started yelling about how I embarrass him in front of his family by acting like I'm their equal. I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel as Emma's story unfolded. Derek Walsh had been systematically chipping away at my granddaughter's self-worth for the past 6 months of their marriage, but tonight he'd escalated to something that could literally kill her in this weather. "Emma, what happened after you disagreed with him?" He grabbed my arm and dragged me to the front door, told his whole family that I needed to learn respect. Then he pushed me outside in my nightgown and locked the door. Grandma, his parents, and brothers were just standing there watching. Nobody tried to stop him. The image of my granddaughter, the child I'd raised from age 8 after losing her parents, the young woman I'd supported through college and celebrated at her wedding 6 months ago, being humiliated and endangered by the man who'd promised to love and protect her, filled me with a cold fury that made the winter night feel warm by comparison. "Sweetheart, I can see Derek's house now. I'm pulling into the driveway. Through the snow, I could make out a figure huddled on the front porch of the Walsh family's imposing brick colonial. Emma was curled into a ball against the front door, her dark hair wet with snow, her bare legs pulled up under her thin nightgown in a futile attempt to preserve body heat. I parked directly behind Derek's Mercedes, blocking it in the driveway, and grabbed my medical kit and the heavy wool blanket I kept in my back seat for emergencies. "Emma!" She looked up as I approached, her lips blue with cold, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. I wrapped the blanket around her and immediately began assessing her condition with the systematic efficiency that had served me through 4 decades of emergency medicine. "Grandma, I can't stop shaking. My feet are numb. You're going into hypothermia, sweetheart. We need to get you warm immediately." I helped Emma to her feet and supported her weight as we walked toward my car. That's when the front door opened and Derek Walsh stepped onto the porch, his face flushed with alcohol and self-righteous anger. "What's she doing here?" Derek demanded, gesturing at me with the kind of dismissive contempt that suggested he viewed me as an unwelcome intrusion on his disciplinary action. "I'm here to collect my granddaughter who you left to freeze to death on Christmas Eve," I replied, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed from years of dealing with difficult patients and their families. "She needed to learn some respect. Maybe next time she'll think twice before embarrassing me in front of my family." Derek stood in his doorway wearing pajamas and slippers, completely warm and comfortable, while Emma had been dying of cold just feet away. The casual cruelty of it, the calculated nature of choosing Christmas Eve to humiliate someone he knew had no other family to turn to, revealed everything I needed to know about Derek Walsh's character. "Derek, you put my granddaughter's life in danger. The temperature is negative 10 degrees. She could have died from exposure. Don't be dramatic. It's just a little cold. Emma grew up poor, so she should be tough enough to handle some discomfort." The casual way Derek dismissed potentially fatal hypothermia as a little cold told me that this wasn't just drunken poor judgment. This was deliberate abuse from someone who'd calculated exactly how to hurt Emma in the most devastating way possible. I looked at Derek Walsh, 27 years old, privileged, and completely confident that his family's money and social position made him untouchable, and realized he had no idea who he'd just made an enemy of. "Derek, you made a serious mistake tonight. The only mistake I made was not teaching Emma respect sooner. She's an orphan who should be grateful that someone from my family was willing to marry her. But instead, she acts like she deserves the same treatment as people who actually matter." The words hung in the cold air like poison, revealing the depth of Derek's contempt for Emma and his assumption that her lack of family made her powerless against his abuse. What Derek didn't know was that Margaret O'Sullivan wasn't just some insignificant old woman collecting her granddaughter. I was the head emergency nurse who'd saved the lives of half this town for 40 years, the woman who delivered 3 of the current city council members, and the person who knew exactly where every important family in this community kept their secrets buried. I helped Emma into my car and turned the heat on maximum, then walked back to where Derek stood smugly on his porch, apparently convinced that he'd successfully put both Emma and me in our place. Derek, I want you to remember this moment very clearly. What moment? The moment your granddaughter learned that actions have consequences? I looked directly into Derek Walsh's eyes, noting the way alcohol had made him loose and overconfident, the way privilege had made him assume he was untouchable, and the way cruelty had made him underestimate the woman standing in front of him. No, Derek, the moment you declared war on the wrong family. As I drove away with Emma wrapped in blankets and beginning to warm up, I realized that Derek Walsh had just made the kind of enemy that his money and family connections couldn't protect him from. Some men assumed that hurting orphans would be consequence-free. Tonight, Derek was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption could be. I drove straight to the emergency room, where I'd worked for 4 decades, knowing that Emma needed immediate medical evaluation for hypothermia, and that I needed to document everything that had happened tonight with the precision that would hold up in court. Dr. James Rivera, who'd been a resident when I was head nurse and was now the ER chief, took one look at Emma's condition and immediately began treatment protocols I'd helped establish years earlier. Maggie, what happened here? Domestic abuse. Her husband locked her outside in her nightgown with a temperature of -10 degrees. She was on that porch for nearly 20 minutes before I could get to her. Jesus, core temperature is 94 degrees. She's definitely hypothermic, but we caught it early enough to avoid serious complications. As Dr. Rivera worked to stabilize Emma's body temperature, I used my phone to photograph the frostbite forming on her toes, the blue tinge around her lips, and the way her whole body was still shaking uncontrollably despite the heated blankets. Grandma Maggie, what are you doing? Documenting evidence, sweetheart. Emma, what Derek did tonight constitutes attempted murder in some jurisdictions. We're going to make sure there's a complete medical record of what he did to you. But he didn't mean to actually hurt me. He was just angry and drunk. I stopped taking photographs and looked at my granddaughter, this young woman I'd raised to be strong and independent, who was now making excuses for a man who'd nearly killed her out of spite. Emma, attempted murder doesn't require intent to kill. It requires creating conditions that could reasonably result in death. Locking someone outside in deadly cold, wearing only a nightgown meets that standard. Grandma, I don't want to cause problems for Derek's family. They have a reputation in this town. And I have a reputation in this town too, Emma. The difference is that mine is built on saving lives, not on covering up the behavior of abusive men. Dr. Rivera finished his examination and pulled me aside while Emma was getting additional warming treatment. Maggie, I need to ask you something as both a friend and a medical professional. Is this the first incident of abuse, or has there been a pattern? I thought about the past 6 months of Emma's marriage, the way she'd become quieter and more apologetic, the way she'd started canceling family dinners because Derek didn't feel comfortable with her spending time away from him, the way her confidence had steadily eroded under his constant criticism of her background and origins. There's been a pattern of psychological abuse, but this is the first time he's escalated to potentially lethal physical endangerment. In my professional opinion, this won't be the last escalation unless someone intervenes. Maggie, men who are willing to risk their partner's life over perceived disrespect don't typically de-escalate on their own. After Emma was medically cleared and we'd completed all documentation, I drove her to my house instead of taking her back to Derek. She was exhausted, traumatized, and still making excuses for the man who'd nearly killed her. Grandma, Derek is going to be worried when he realizes I'm not coming home tonight. Derek should be worried, but not about your whereabouts. He should be worried about the consequences of what he did. I settled Emma on my couch with hot tea and warm blankets, then sat down across from her to have the conversation I'd been dreading since the phone call that shattered my peaceful Christmas Eve. Emma, I need you to understand something about what happened tonight. Derek didn't lock you outside because he was drunk or angry. He locked you outside because he wanted to demonstrate that he has absolute power over your safety and survival. Grandma, you don't know Derek like I do. He has a good heart, but he gets frustrated when I don't understand how his family operates. Emma, stop. I used the firm voice that had commanded respect in emergency rooms for 40 years. Derek Walsh deliberately endangered your life to punish you for disagreeing with him in public. That's not frustration. That's calculated abuse. But his family is so respected in this community. His father owns the bank. His mother runs all the charity organizations. They must have been shocked by Derek's behavior tonight. Emma, Derek's family watched him push you outside in deadly weather and didn't intervene. That tells me everything I need to know about their character and their respect for your well-being. I walked to my kitchen and retrieved the folder I'd been compiling since Emma's wedding. Newspaper clippings, social media posts, and public records that painted a picture of Derek Walsh that his family's money and influence had kept carefully hidden. Emma, there's something you need to know about Derek's history. I opened the folder and showed her the police report from 2 years earlier. Domestic violence charges against Derek that had been quietly dropped after his father made substantial donations to the victim's family and the police benevolent fund. Derek has done this before? Derek has done worse before. His previous girlfriend filed charges for assault and battery. The case was dismissed when she suddenly decided not to testify, but the medical records from her emergency room visit are public record. Emma's face went pale as she read the documentation of Derek's ex-girlfriend's injuries. Broken ribs, concussion, facial bruising that had required reconstructive surgery. Grandma, how did you find this information? Emma, I've been a nurse in this community for 40 years. I know every doctor, every police officer, every court clerk, and every social worker. When Derek started isolating you from family and friends, I began asking questions. You've been investigating my husband? I've been protecting my granddaughter from a man I suspected was dangerous. Tonight proved that my suspicions were justified. Emma sat quietly for several minutes, processing the evidence that the man she'd married was not the charming, successful businessman his family had presented him to be. Grandma, what am I supposed to do with this information? You're supposed to file for divorce before Derek escalates to the level of violence he used against his previous victim. But I love him. And Grandma, where would I go? This is a small town, and the Walsh family controls so much of the business and social structure here. I reached across the coffee table and took Emma's hands in mine, looking into the eyes of the 8-year-old child I'd promised to protect when her parents died, now seeing the 23-year-old woman who needed that same protection from a different kind of threat. Emma, you'll go wherever you need to go to be safe, and you'll have my full support, financial, emotional, and legal, in rebuilding your life away from Derek Walsh. What about Derek's family? They have influence and money. They could make our lives very difficult. I smiled at Emma's concern, thinking about the phone calls I would be making tomorrow to people who owed me decades of favors, who respected my judgment, and who had the power to ensure that Derek Walsh faced appropriate consequences for what he'd done tonight. Sweetheart, the Walsh family has money and social influence, but I have something more powerful. I have relationships built on 40 years of saving lives and serving this community. What does that mean? It means that Derek Walsh picked the wrong orphan to abuse because this orphan has a grandmother who knows exactly where every important person in this town keeps their secrets buried. Some families thought money made them untouchable. Tomorrow, Derek Walsh would discover that some nurses had more real power than all the bank accounts in the world, and some grandmothers were prepared to go to war to protect the children they'd raised. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold, but I was already dressed and making phone calls by 7 a.m. while Emma slept on my couch, still recovering from her hypothermia ordeal. The first call I made was to Police Chief Robert Martinez, who'd been one of my patients 15 years ago when he'd nearly died from a heart attack I'd helped save him from. Maggie, Merry Christmas. What's got you calling so early? Robert, I need to file a domestic violence report and discuss attempted murder charges against Derek Walsh. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Derek Walsh? From the banking family? Maggie, what happened? I provided Robert with a detailed account of the previous night's events, including Emma's medical documentation from the ER and the photographs I'd taken of her condition. Robert, Emma was in stage 1 hypothermia when I found her. Another 20 minutes, and we could have been looking at organ failure or death. Maggie, I know the Walsh family. They're major contributors to police programs and community charities. Are you certain about these allegations? Robert, I'm certain about the medical evidence. I'm certain about the witness testimony. And I'm certain that Derek Walsh has a history of violence against women that his family has been covering up. I heard Robert's tone shift as he recognized that I wasn't making emotional accusations, but presenting factual evidence with the precision I'd used in 40 years of medical documentation. What kind of history? Police report from 2 years ago involving his previous girlfriend, domestic violence charges that were mysteriously dropped after substantial donations to various community organizations. Maggie, I'll need to see all documentation. Can you bring everything to the station this morning? I'll be there at 9 a.m. And Robert, I want Derek Walsh arrested today. After ending the call with Chief Martinez, I called Judge Patricia Hernandez, whose daughter's life I'd saved during a complicated childbirth emergency 10 years earlier. Patricia, I need an emergency restraining order against Derek Walsh for my granddaughter Emma. Maggie, it's Christmas morning. What's the emergency? I explained the situation in detail, emphasizing the medical evidence and Derek's history of violence. Patricia, this man nearly killed my granddaughter last night, and he has a documented pattern of escalating abuse. Emma needs legal protection immediately. Maggie, Bring me all documentation at noon. I'll review everything and issue an emergency protective order if the evidence supports it. My third call was to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the psychiatrist who specialized in domestic abuse cases and who'd worked with me on dozens of emergency situations involving traumatized patients. Sarah, I need a psychological evaluation for my granddaughter, who's a victim of domestic abuse. The perpetrator escalated to life-threatening violence last night. Maggie, of course. When can you bring her in? This afternoon. Sarah, I also need professional documentation that Derek Walsh's behavior pattern indicates high risk for lethal violence. Based on what you've described, that documentation will be very easy to provide. By 9 a.m., I was at the police station with Emma, who was still reluctant to press charges against Derek, but was beginning to understand the seriousness of what had happened to her. Grandma Maggie, what if Derek's family retaliates against us? What if they use their influence to make problems for you? Emma, let me worry about the Walsh family's influence. Right now, I want you to focus on telling Chief Martinez exactly what Derek did to you. Chief Martinez interviewed Emma with the thorough professionalism I'd expected, documenting every detail of Derek's verbal and physical abuse while treating her with the respect and sensitivity that domestic violence victims deserved. Emma, based on your testimony and the medical evidence, we have probable cause to arrest Derek for domestic assault and reckless endangerment. Are you prepared to press charges? Emma looked at me with fear and uncertainty in her eyes. I could see her struggling between loyalty to the man she'd married and recognition of the danger he posed to her life. Chief Martinez, what happens if I press charges? Derek will be arrested and charged. He'll be held until arraignment, and you'll be eligible for a protective order that legally prohibits him from contacting or approaching you. And what happens to me? Where do I go? What do I do for work? I reached over and took Emma's hand, recognizing that her fear of Derek was compounded by practical concerns about rebuilding her life without his family's financial support. Emma, you have options that Derek's family can't control or eliminate. You have people who will protect and support you that money can't influence. Grandma, I'm scared. You should be scared, sweetheart. But you should be more scared of what Derek will do to you next time than what his family might do in retaliation for you protecting yourself. After Emma signed the formal complaint, Chief Martinez assured us that Derek would be arrested before noon and that the charges would be prosecuted regardless of any pressure from the Walsh family. Maggie, I want you to know that this case will be handled with complete professionalism. Derek Walsh's family connections won't affect how we treat these serious allegations. Robert, I appreciate your integrity, and I want you to know that if the Walsh family tries to interfere with this investigation, I have information about Derek's history that might interest the district attorney. That afternoon, while Emma was having her psychological evaluation with Dr. Mitchell, I received a phone call that told me Derek's family was already mobilizing their influence to minimize his consequences. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is Margaret Walsh, Derek's mother. I think we need to discuss this unfortunate misunderstanding. Mrs. Walsh, there's no misunderstanding. Your son nearly killed my granddaughter last night. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Derek was intoxicated and made poor judgment. But surely we can resolve this matter privately without involving the police and courts. Mrs. Walsh, your son has a history of violence against women. Last night's incident wasn't poor judgment. It was attempted murder. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I think you're overreacting to what was essentially a marital disagreement. The Walsh family is prepared to ensure that Emma receives appropriate compensation for her distress. The casual way Margaret Walsh dismissed attempted murder as a marital disagreement that could be resolved with money told me everything I needed to know about how Derek had learned that violence was an acceptable way to control women. Mrs. Walsh, Derek is going to face criminal charges for what he did. Your money won't change that. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I think you underestimate the Walsh family's influence in this community. We've been major contributors to police programs, judicial campaigns, and community organizations for decades. Mrs. Walsh, I think you underestimate Margaret O'Sullivan's influence in this community. I've been saving lives here for 40 years, and I know exactly which community leaders owe their children's lives to my medical intervention. The silence on Mrs. Walsh's end of the line told me that she was beginning to realize that intimidation and bribery wouldn't work with someone who had deeper, more personal relationships with the people who controlled law enforcement and judicial decisions. Mrs. O'Sullivan, what do you want? I want Derek prosecuted for domestic violence and attempted murder. I want him to serve jail time, and I want your family to understand that covering up his crimes will have consequences that your money can't fix. You're making a terrible mistake threatening the Walsh family. Mrs. Walsh, I'm not threatening anyone. I'm promising that Derek will face consequences for nearly killing my granddaughter, regardless of your family's wealth or influence. After ending the call, I realized that the battle for Emma's safety was about to escalate beyond criminal charges into a full-scale war between two very different kinds of power. The Walsh family had money and social influence, But I had something more valuable. Relationships built on life and death trust with people who controlled the institutions that would determine Derek's fate. Some families thought their wealth made them untouchable. Tonight, Derek Walsh would be sleeping in a jail cell, learning that some grandmothers had more real power than all the bank accounts in the world. Derek was arrested at 2:30 p.m. on Christmas Day, while his family was hosting their annual holiday gathering. Chief Martinez personally handled the arrest, ensuring that Derek was taken from his parents' house in handcuffs in full view of their prestigious guests. I received the confirmation call while sitting with Emma in my living room, where she was finally beginning to process the reality of what Derek had done to her, and what his family's immediate attempt to cover it up revealed about their character. Grandma Maggie, Derek's been texting me from jail. He says this is all a misunderstanding, and that if I love him, I'll ask you to drop the charges. I looked at the messages Emma showed me on her phone, noting the manipulation tactics Derek was using, even from his jail cell. Appeals to loyalty, promises to change, and subtle threats about what would happen if she didn't cooperate with his family's damage control efforts. Emma, what does your heart tell you about those messages? My heart is confused, but my brain is starting to understand that Derek sees getting arrested as an inconvenience rather than a consequence for nearly killing me. What do you mean? He's not apologizing for locking me outside in deadly cold. He's apologizing for letting things get out of hand and promising to manage his drinking better. Derek still doesn't think what he did was attempted murder. I felt proud of Emma for recognizing the difference between genuine remorse and manipulation designed to avoid accountability. Emma, what do you want to do about Derek's requests for you to intervene? I want to block his number and focus on healing from what he did to me instead of managing his feelings about facing consequences. At 4 p.m., I received an unexpected visit from Derek's father, William Walsh, who arrived at my door with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to solving problems through intimidation and financial leverage. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I believe we need to discuss the situation involving Derek and your granddaughter. Mr. Walsh, Derek nearly killed Emma last night. There's nothing to discuss except his criminal prosecution. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Derek made a mistake while intoxicated. But surely we can resolve this matter without destroying his future over what was essentially poor judgment during a marital disagreement. I studied William Walsh, 65 years old, impeccably dressed even on Christmas Day, radiating the entitlement that came from decades of using money to make problems disappear, and realized that Derek's abusive behavior was a family pattern rather than an individual flaw. Mr. Walsh, Derek has a documented history of violence against women. Last night's incident was attempted murder, not poor judgment. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I've reviewed Derek's record, and there are no convictions for violence. Whatever allegations you're referring to were resolved through appropriate legal channels. You mean they were covered up through bribes and intimidation? William's expression shifted from diplomatic to calculating, apparently recognizing that charm and reason weren't effective with someone who understood exactly how his family operated. Mrs. O'Sullivan, the Walsh family has significant influence in this community. We've supported police programs, funded judicial campaigns, and contributed to every major charitable organization in this county. Mr. Walsh, are you threatening me? I'm explaining reality. Mrs. O'Sullivan, your granddaughter's allegations against Derek will be very difficult to prove, especially when they're contradicted by testimony from respected community members who witnessed the incident. What respected community members? Derek's family members who were present last night and who will testify that Emma was behaving erratically due to alcohol consumption and that Derek was simply trying to help her get some fresh air to sober up. I felt cold anger settling in my chest as I realized that William Walsh was prepared to commit perjury and suborn perjury to protect his son from consequences for nearly murdering my granddaughter. Mr. Walsh, are you suggesting that your family will lie under oath to cover up Derek's attempted murder? I'm suggesting that different people can witness the same events and reach different conclusions about what actually happened. Mr. Walsh, Emma has medical documentation of hypothermia and frostbite consistent with prolonged exposure to deadly cold. That's not alcohol-related erratic behavior. That's evidence of life-threatening abuse. Medical evidence can be interpreted in various ways, Mrs. O'Sullivan, especially when the treating physician has personal relationships that might affect his professional judgment. The threat was clear. William Walsh was prepared to attack Dr. Rivera's credibility and my own reputation to protect Derek from criminal prosecution. Mr. Walsh, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that Emma withdraw her allegations in exchange for a generous settlement that would ensure her financial security for life. Derek would agree to a quiet divorce, and both parties could move forward without the publicity and expense of criminal proceedings. You're offering to buy Emma's silence about attempted murder? I'm offering to resolve a private family matter in a way that benefits everyone involved. I looked at William Walsh and realized that he genuinely believed that money could purchase the right to nearly murder someone without consequences, that wealth provided exemption from basic human decency and legal accountability. Mr. Walsh, Emma isn't interested in your money. She's interested in justice for what Derek did to her. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I think you're underestimating the challenges Emma will face in pursuing this matter. The Walsh family has resources to ensure that these proceedings become very difficult and expensive for everyone involved. Mr. Walsh, I think you're underestimating Margaret O'Sullivan's resources and determination to see Derek prosecuted for attempted murder. What resources could you possibly have that would match the Walsh family's influence? I smiled at William Walsh's assumption that his money and social connections made him more powerful than a woman who'd spent 40 years earning the trust and gratitude of every important person in this community through life and death service. Mr. Walsh, I have relationships with people whose children's lives I saved, whose emergencies I handled, whose crises I managed. You have people whose campaigns you funded and whose charities you supported. Let's see which kind of influence matters more when it comes to protecting a young woman from a violent criminal. Mrs. O'Sullivan, you're making a serious mistake threatening the Walsh family. Mr. Walsh, I'm not threatening anyone. I'm promising that Derek will face full prosecution for attempted murder, regardless of your family's wealth or willingness to commit perjury to protect him. You'll regret this decision. The only thing I'll regret is if I hadn't done enough to protect Emma from your son's violence. After William Walsh left, Emma emerged from the kitchen where she'd been listening to our conversation. Grandma Maggie, they really think they can buy their way out of attempted murder charges? They think money solves every problem because it's always solved their problems before. What happens now? Now we prove that some problems can't be solved with bribes, threats, or perjury. Grandma, I'm scared of what the Walsh family might do to retaliate. Emma, the Walsh family should be scared of what happens when they declare war on someone who knows where every important person in this town keeps their secrets buried. Some families thought their wealth made them above the law. Tomorrow, Derek Walsh would learn that some crimes couldn't be covered up, some victims couldn't be bought, and some grandmothers had more real power than all the money in the world. The war for Emma's justice was about to begin in earnest. The next morning, I woke to find my driveway blocked by a news van from the regional television station. Word about Derek Walsh's arrest had leaked, and suddenly the story of a prominent banker's son charged with domestic violence was becoming public in ways his family couldn't control. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm Jennifer Torres from Channel 7 News. Can you comment on the charges against Derek Walsh? I stepped onto my porch, noting that Emma was still safely inside and that the reporter seemed genuinely interested in the story rather than trying to spin it in Derek's favor. Derek Walsh nearly killed my granddaughter on Christmas Eve by locking her outside in deadly cold weather wearing only a nightgown. The medical evidence speaks for itself. Mrs. O'Sullivan, the Walsh family issued a statement claiming this was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. How do you respond to that? Hypothermia and frostbite aren't misunderstandings. They're medical evidence of life-threatening abuse. Are you concerned about legal retaliation from one of the county's most influential families? I looked directly into the camera, thinking about every domestic violence victim I'd treated over 40 years, every woman who'd been too afraid to speak out against powerful abusers, every family that had used wealth to cover up crimes. The Walsh family's influence doesn't extend to medical facts or criminal evidence. Derek Walsh committed attempted murder, and he'll face appropriate consequences regardless of his family's wealth. After the news crew left, I received a call from District Attorney Michael Santos, whose wife I'd helped deliver during emergency complications that nearly cost both mother and baby their lives. Maggie, I've reviewed the police report and medical evidence. This is a solid case for aggravated domestic assault with potential attempted murder charges. Michael, Derek's family is already mobilizing to cover this up. His father visited me yesterday, offering bribes and making threats about perjury. Maggie, let me be clear. The Walsh family's influence won't affect my prosecution of this case. The evidence is overwhelming, and domestic violence is a priority for this office. Michael, there's something else you need to know. Derek has a history of violence that his family covered up through intimidation and financial pressure. What kind of history? Police report from 2 years ago involving assault charges that were dropped after his father made substantial donations to various organizations. I have documentation of the victim's injuries and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the case dismissal. Maggie, bring me everything you have. If Derek Walsh has a pattern of violence, that information will strengthen our case significantly. That afternoon, Emma and I met with the district attorney to provide comprehensive testimony about Derek's abuse and his family's attempts at cover-up. Emma had spent the morning with Dr. Mitchell, who'd provided a psychological evaluation documenting the trauma and intimidation tactics typical of domestic abuse escalation. Emma, I need you to understand that prosecuting this case will require courage, DA Santos explained. The Walsh family will use every resource at their disposal to discredit you and minimize Derek's actions. What kind of discrediting? They'll attack your character, your motivations, your mental state, and your credibility. They'll claim you're seeking money or attention. They'll try to make Derek look like the victim of a vindictive prosecution. Emma looked at me with uncertainty, clearly intimidated by the prospect of facing the Walsh family's wealth and influence in a public trial. Grandma Maggie, what if I can't handle the pressure? What if they destroy my reputation in this town? Emma, your reputation will survive because it's built on truth and supported by people who care about justice. Derek's reputation should be destroyed because it's built on lies and protected by people who care about money. Mr. Santos, what happens if Derek is convicted? For aggravated domestic assault with endangerment, he's looking at 2 to 5 years in prison, plus mandatory counseling and permanent restraining orders. And if he's not convicted, then he remains free to escalate his violence against you or other women, probably with even more confidence because he'll believe his family's wealth makes him untouchable. After leaving the DA's office, Emma and I stopped at the bank where Derek's father was president, ostensibly to close Emma's joint account with Derek, but actually to send a message that we weren't intimidated by the Walsh family's financial influence. William Walsh emerged from his office the moment we entered the building, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment about the morning's news coverage. Mrs. O'Sullivan, you've made a serious mistake talking to reporters about family matters. Mr. Walsh, attempted murder isn't a family matter. It's a criminal matter that deserves public attention. You're destroying Derek's reputation and career over what was a private disagreement. Derek destroyed his own reputation when he nearly killed my granddaughter in front of witnesses. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this prosecution will cost Emma her privacy and subject her to scrutiny that could follow her for years. I realized that William Walsh was still trying to manipulate Emma through fear and intimidation, apparently believing that threatening consequences for seeking justice would convince her to withdraw her charges. Mr. Walsh, Emma's privacy is less important than preventing Derek from murdering his next victim. You're being dramatically unrealistic about what happened Christmas Eve. Mr. Walsh, I'm being medically accurate about hypothermia and legally accurate about attempted murder. That evening, I received a phone call that confirmed my suspicions about how far the Walsh family was willing to go to protect Derek from consequences. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is Dr. Patricia Donovan from the State Medical Board. We've received a complaint about your conduct in the Derek Walsh case. What kind of complaint? Allegations that you've exceeded your professional authority by providing medical opinions outside your scope of practice, and that you've used your medical background to manipulate evidence in a domestic dispute involving your family member. I felt cold anger settle in my chest as I realized that the Walsh family had attempted to destroy my professional reputation to discredit my testimony about Emma's medical condition. Dr. Donovan, I provided emergency medical assessment to a hypothermia victim and documented her condition with the same precision I've used for 40 years of emergency medicine. Mrs. O'Sullivan, the complaint suggests that your personal involvement compromised your professional judgment. Dr. Donovan, my personal involvement motivated me to provide the highest standard of medical care and documentation. I'd like to know who filed this complaint and what specific allegations they're making. The complaint was filed by Dr. Richard Hayes, who claims that your medical opinion about the severity of Ms. Walsh's condition was exaggerated due to family bias. Dr. Richard Hayes was the Walsh family's personal physician, a man who'd built his practice by providing wealthy families with medical opinions that supported their legal and financial interests rather than medical facts. Dr. Donovan, I'd welcome a full investigation of my medical assessment and documentation. I'm confident that any objective review will confirm that my granddaughter was in life-threatening condition when I found her. Mrs. O'Sullivan, the board will review all evidence and provide a determination within 30 days. After ending the call, I realized that the Walsh family strategy was becoming clear. They were trying to discredit every person and institution that supported Emma's case, hoping to isolate her from advocates and create doubt about the severity of what Derek had done. But what the Walsh family didn't understand was that attacking my medical reputation would backfire spectacularly when 40 years of respected emergency care was weighed against their obvious financial motivation for lying. Emma, the Walsh family just made their biggest mistake yet. What happened? They tried to destroy my credibility with the medical board. Now every doctor and nurse in this county will understand exactly what kind of family we're fighting against. Some families thought intimidation and character assassination would protect their criminals from consequences. Tomorrow, the Walsh family would discover that attacking Margaret O'Sullivan's medical reputation would unite every healthcare professional in the county against Derek's defense. The war for Emma's justice was about to get much more intense, but also much more public. Within 24 hours of the medical board complaint, my phone rang with more support than I could have imagined. The first call came from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the current chief of emergency medicine. Maggie, the entire medical staff is furious about this attack on your reputation. We're organizing a formal letter of support signed by every physician and nurse who's worked with you. Elena, I appreciate the support, but I don't want this to become a distraction from Emma's case. Maggie, this isn't a distraction. This is exactly the evidence everyone needs to see about how the Walsh family operates. They're willing to destroy a nurse's 40-year reputation to protect their son from murder charges. The second call came from nurse supervisor Maria Santos, who'd trained under me 15 years earlier. Maggie, we're calling an emergency meeting of the Nurses Association tonight. This attack on you is an attack on every nurse who's ever documented abuse injuries and testified against powerful abusers. Maria, what kind of meeting? The kind where we make it clear to everyone in this county that trying to discredit Margaret O'Sullivan's medical judgment is like trying to argue that the sky isn't blue. Maggie, you've saved more lives and documented more accurate medical evidence than any nurse in this county's history. By evening, the meeting hall was packed with medical professionals who understood that the Walsh family's attack on my credibility was an attack on the integrity of medical documentation in abuse cases. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rodriguez addressed the crowd. Margaret O'Sullivan has provided 40 years of exemplary medical service to this community. Her documentation of hypothermia and frostbite in the Emma Walsh case represents the same precision and integrity she's demonstrated in thousands of emergency situations. The Walsh family's attempt to discredit Nurse O'Sullivan's medical assessment is an obvious attempt to undermine evidence of their son's attempted murder, added Dr. Rivera from the ER. This isn't about family disputes. This is about protecting a documented pattern of violence against women. The meeting concluded with a unanimous vote to provide formal testimony supporting my medical credibility and to publicly condemn attempts to intimidate healthcare professionals who document abuse evidence. Meanwhile, Emma was staying with me, while the restraining order kept Derek away from both of us. She'd been reading the medical board complaint and Derek's family's public statements, finally understanding the scope of their efforts to avoid accountability. Grandma Maggie, they're really claiming that I wasn't in any real danger on Christmas Eve? They're claiming that hypothermia and frostbite are normal consequences of getting fresh air during a marital disagreement. That's insane. I couldn't feel my toes for 2 hours, and my lips were blue when you found me. Emma, the Walsh family is desperate. They know Derek faces serious prison time if a jury sees the medical evidence, so they're trying to convince people that medical facts aren't actually facts. What happens if people believe them? People won't believe them, because 40 years of medical professionals are going to testify that my documentation is accurate and that Derek's family is lying to protect a violent criminal. The next morning brought news that the Walsh family's intimidation campaign was expanding beyond medical credibility. Chief Martinez called to inform me that Derek's lawyer had filed motions challenging the arrest, the charges, and the evidence collection procedures. Maggie, Derek's attorney is claiming that the arrest was based on false information provided by a biased family member and that the charges are excessive compared to what actually occurred. Robert, what kind of motions? They're arguing that Derek was intoxicated and not responsible for his actions, that Emma was equally intoxicated and her memory of events is unreliable, and that the medical evidence was misinterpreted by someone with personal bias. In other words, they're claiming that attempted murder doesn't count if the perpetrator was drunk and if the victim's family cares about the evidence. Exactly. Maggie, this is standard defense strategy for wealthy defendants. Attack the credibility of everyone involved and claim that money equals innocence. How strong is their legal position? Weak on facts, strong on resources. They can afford to drag this case out for years with motions, appeals, and character assassination. The question is whether you and Emma have the stamina for a long legal battle. I thought about Emma, who was finally beginning to understand that Derek's abuse wasn't her fault and that his family's cover-up revealed their true character. Robert, we have the stamina for however long it takes to see Derek convicted of attempted murder. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor, Derek's ex-girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell, who'd driven 2 hours from Sacramento after seeing the news coverage about Derek's arrest. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I saw the news about Derek Walsh, and I need to tell someone what he did to me 2 years ago. Sarah was a quiet, serious woman in her mid-20s who carried herself with the careful control of someone who'd survived significant trauma. Sarah, I know about the charges that were dropped. Are you willing to testify about Derek's pattern of violence? Mrs. O'Sullivan, Derek's family paid me $50,000 to disappear and never talk about what he did to me. But watching them try to destroy your granddaughter's credibility, I can't stay silent anymore. What exactly did Derek do to you? He put me in the hospital with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and facial injuries that required reconstructive surgery. When I tried to press charges, his father offered me money to reconsider, and his mother explained that testifying would ruin Derek's future and destroy my own reputation in ways I couldn't imagine. And you accepted their offer? I was 23, scared, broke, and intimidated by lawyers who made it clear that fighting the Walsh family would be more expensive and traumatic than taking their money and moving away. Sarah, what's changed now? I've had 2 years to realize that taking their money didn't heal my trauma. It just enabled Derek to hurt other women. Mrs. O'Sullivan, if I'd been brave enough to testify then, your granddaughter wouldn't have nearly died on Christmas Eve. Sarah, are you prepared to testify now, despite the risks? I'm prepared to tell the truth about Derek Walsh's violence, regardless of what his family tries to do to me in retaliation. I called District Attorney Santos immediately to arrange for Sarah's testimony, recognizing that her willingness to speak out would establish Derek's pattern of escalating violence and his family's pattern of covering up serious crimes. Michael, Derek's previous victim wants to testify about his history of violence and his family's intimidation tactics. Maggie, that changes everything. Pattern evidence showing escalation from assault to attempted murder will make conviction much more likely. Michael, Sarah also has evidence of witness intimidation and bribery by Derek's family. That's even better. If we can prove that the Walsh family has a history of obstructing justice to protect Derek, it undermines their credibility completely. That evening, as Emma, Sarah, and I sat in my living room planning testimony that would expose Derek's pattern of violence, I realized that the Walsh family's overconfidence had created the coalition that would ensure Derek's conviction. Grandma Maggie, Emma said, I understand now why you weren't afraid of Derek's family's threats. You knew that attacking good people would unite everyone against them. Emma, bullies always overestimate their power and underestimate their victim's strength. The Walsh family assumed that money could buy silence, intimidation could prevent testimony, and attacks on credibility could undermine evidence. And they were wrong? They were catastrophically wrong. Because some things, medical evidence, witness testimony, and community respect, can't be bought, intimidated, or destroyed by wealthy criminals and their families. Some families thought their wealth made them untouchable. Tomorrow, Derek Walsh would discover that some crimes created evidence that money couldn't eliminate and witnesses that intimidation couldn't silence. The war for Emma's justice was about to escalate into a battle that would expose the Walsh family's true character to the entire community. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the first week of January, and Derek's defense attorney, Richard Morrison, one of the state's most expensive criminal lawyers, had clearly prepared a strategy designed to overwhelm our small-town case with legal sophistication and character assassination. Your Honor, Morrison began, my client is a respected businessman from a prominent family who made a poor decision while intoxicated during what was essentially a marital disagreement. The prosecution's characterization of this incident as attempted murder is a dramatic overreach influenced by family bias and personal vendetta. I sat in the courtroom watching Morrison attempt to reframe Derek's attempted murder as a minor domestic dispute, noting how he emphasized Derek's family status and wealth while dismissing the medical evidence as emotional exaggeration. District Attorney Santos stood to present our case with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most successful prosecutors in the region. Your Honor, the evidence shows that Derek Walsh deliberately locked his wife outside in deadly cold weather, knowing that exposure to -10 degrees in only a nightgown could result in death. The victim suffered documented hypothermia and frostbite consistent with life-threatening exposure. Furthermore, Mr. Walsh has a documented history of violence against women that his family has covered up through intimidation and bribery. This case represents escalation in a pattern of abuse that will continue unless Mr. Walsh faces appropriate consequences. Judge Hernandez reviewed the evidence with the careful attention I'd expected from someone who understood the seriousness of domestic violence cases. Mr. Morrison, how does your client explain the medical evidence of hypothermia and frostbite? Your Honor, my client acknowledges that Mrs. Walsh experienced some discomfort from cold exposure, but the prosecution's medical expert has personal bias that compromises her professional judgment. I felt anger flare as Morrison attempted to dismiss Emma's near-death experience as some discomfort while attacking my 40 years of medical credibility. Mr. Santos, what medical evidence supports the attempted murder charges? Your Honor, we have documentation from the emergency room showing stage 1 hypothermia, frostbite, and physiological evidence consistent with exposure that could have resulted in organ failure or death within minutes. Your Honor, Morrison interjected, the prosecution's medical evidence comes from a family member whose emotional investment compromises her ability to provide objective assessment. Judge Hernandez looked directly at Morrison with the expression of someone who'd heard enough attempts to discredit well-established medical evidence. Mr. Morrison, are you arguing that hypothermia and frostbite can be caused by emotional bias rather than cold exposure? Your Honor, I'm arguing that the severity and interpretation of Mrs. Walsh's condition has been exaggerated by someone with personal motivation to see my client prosecuted. Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed Nurse O'Sullivan's medical credentials and 40-year service record. Unless you have evidence that hypothermia can be faked or that frostbite can be caused by family bias, I suggest you focus on actual legal defenses rather than character assassination of respected medical professionals. I felt satisfaction watching Morrison's strategy backfire as Judge Hernandez recognized the weakness of attacking established medical facts through personal attacks on my credibility. Your Honor, D.A. Santos continued, we also have testimony from Mr. Walsh's previous victim, who will describe similar patterns of violence and his family's attempts to cover up serious crimes through intimidation and bribery. Morrison's confident expression faltered as he realized that Derek's history of violence was going to be admissible evidence. Your Honor, any testimony from previous relationships would be prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific charges in this case. Mr. Morrison, pattern evidence showing escalation from assault to attempted murder is highly relevant to establishing intent and likelihood of future violence. Your Honor, we request that any such testimony be excluded as more prejudicial than probative. Request denied. The court finds that pattern evidence of domestic violence is essential to understanding the context and seriousness of these charges. After the hearing, Emma and I met with Sarah Mitchell to prepare her testimony about Derek's previous violence and his family's cover-up efforts. Sarah, how are you feeling about testifying in open court? Terrified but determined. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Derek's family has already started trying to discredit me. They're spreading rumors that I'm seeking money and attention by making false accusations. What kind of rumors? That I was unstable and vindictive when Derek broke up with me, that I made up the assault allegations to get revenge, and that I'm only testifying now because I want to be part of a high-profile case. I recognize the Walsh family's strategy, the same character assassination they'd attempted against Emma and me, designed to make victims look like opportunistic liars seeking attention rather than survivors seeking justice. Sarah, how are you handling the pressure? I'm reminding myself that staying silent 2 years ago enabled Derek to nearly kill Emma. If I let intimidation work again, he'll hurt someone else next time. And if Derek's family escalates their retaliation efforts, then I'll document everything and add witness intimidation to the charges Derek's already facing. That evening, I received a call from Jennifer Torres, the television reporter who'd covered Derek's arrest. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm working on a follow-up story about domestic violence prosecutions involving wealthy defendants. Are you willing to discuss how financial influence affects justice in these cases? Jennifer, what specifically are you investigating? The pattern of wealthy families using intimidation, character assassination, and legal resources to protect abusive family members from consequences. Derek Walsh's case appears to be a perfect example of how money complicates domestic violence prosecution. Jennifer, I'd be happy to discuss how the Walsh family has tried to use wealth and influence to cover up attempted murder. Mrs. O'Sullivan, have there been specific threats or intimidation efforts? Threats against my medical credibility, attempts to bribe the victim, character assassination of witnesses, and hiring expensive attorneys to overwhelm the prosecution with frivolous motions. And how has the community responded to these tactics? The medical community has united to support accurate documentation of abuse evidence. Law enforcement has maintained professional integrity despite pressure. And victims have found courage to speak out despite intimidation. Mrs. O'Sullivan, what message do you want to send to other families facing similar situations? I thought about the question, recognizing that Emma's case had become symbolic of broader issues about wealth, power, and justice in domestic violence cases. I want other families to understand that wealthy abusers aren't untouchable, that medical evidence can't be eliminated through character assassination, and that communities can unite to protect victims when institutions maintain integrity. And what about other grandmothers or family members who might be afraid to challenge powerful families? I want them to understand that sometimes protecting someone you love requires war, and that some wars are worth fighting regardless of the enemy's resources. After the interview, Emma asked the question that had been building throughout our legal battle. Grandma Maggie, do you think Derek will actually be convicted? Or will his family's money and influence find a way to make this disappear? I looked at my granddaughter, this young woman who'd survived attempted murder, and found the courage to seek justice despite overwhelming intimidation, and felt proud of her strength and determination. Emma, Derek will be convicted because the evidence is overwhelming, because his pattern of violence is documented, and because this community has decided that wealth doesn't provide exemption from accountability. And if his family tries to appeal or find other ways to avoid consequences, then we'll fight every appeal, challenge every motion, and ensure that Derek serves every day of whatever sentence he receives. Some families thought their wealth could purchase immunity from justice. Tomorrow, Derek Walsh would discover that some evidence couldn't be bought, some witnesses couldn't be intimidated, and some grandmothers had more determination than all the money in the world could overcome. The war for Emma's justice was approaching its climax, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The trial began on a cold February morning, with Derek's defense team presenting what they clearly believed was their strongest strategy, portraying Derek as a respected businessman who'd made a single mistake while intoxicated, while painting Emma as an unstable opportunist seeking financial gain from a wealthy family. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Richard Morrison began his opening statement, "you're going to hear a lot of dramatic testimony about attempted murder and life-threatening violence. But the facts are much simpler. Derek Walsh was intoxicated during an argument with his wife and made poor judgment in asking her to step outside to cool down. What happened next was blown completely out of proportion by family members seeking to destroy a young man's life and reputation." I watched the jury carefully as Morrison spoke, noting that several members seemed skeptical of his attempt to frame attempted murder as poor judgment during marital disagreement. District Attorney Santos delivered his opening with the methodical presentation of evidence that I'd expected from someone who understood the seriousness of domestic violence cases. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that Derek Walsh deliberately locked his wife outside in deadly cold weather, knowing that exposure to -10 degrees in only a nightgown could result in death. This wasn't poor judgment. This was calculated punishment designed to terrorize and potentially kill a woman who disagreed with him in public. Furthermore, you'll hear testimony showing that Derek Walsh has a documented pattern of escalating violence against women, and that his family has used wealth and intimidation to cover up serious crimes. This case isn't about marital disagreement. It's about attempted murder and the abuse of power to avoid consequences. The prosecution's case began with Emma's testimony, which she delivered with quiet strength that impressed everyone in the courtroom. "Mr. Santos, please describe what happened on the evening of December 24th. Derek and I were at his family's Christmas Eve dinner when he made comments about poor people who take advantage of family charity while looking directly at me. When I said that wasn't fair because I work full-time and pay my own expenses, he became angry and said I was embarrassing him in front of his family. What happened next? Derek grabbed my arm and dragged me to the front door. He told his family that I needed to learn respect, then pushed me outside in my nightgown and locked the door behind me. Emma, what was the weather like? It was -10 degrees with snow on the ground. I was wearing only a thin nightgown and slippers. Within minutes, I couldn't feel my toes, and my whole body started shaking uncontrollably. How long were you outside? Nearly 20 minutes before my grandmother arrived. By then, I was so cold that I could barely speak, and my fingers were too numb to operate my phone properly. Emma, what do you believe would have happened if your grandmother hadn't rescued you? Morrison objected to speculation, but the question had already planted the image of Emma dying from exposure while Derek's family watched from their warm house. Dr. Rivera testified next, providing medical evidence that demolished Derek's defense strategy. Doctor, what was Emma's condition when she arrived at the emergency room? She was in stage 1 hypothermia with a core body temperature of 94 degrees. She had early-stage frostbite on her toes and fingers, and she was experiencing the muscle tremors and confusion consistent with dangerous cold exposure. In your medical opinion, what would have happened if Emma had remained outside for another 10 to 15 minutes? She would have progressed to stage 2 hypothermia, which could have resulted in loss of consciousness, cardiac arrhythmia, and potentially death. Doctor, have you reviewed the defense's claim that Emma's condition was exaggerated by family bias? I have, and it's medically absurd. Hypothermia and frostbite are objective medical conditions that can't be faked or exaggerated through emotional bias. The physiological evidence was clear and documented. Morrison's cross-examination of Dr. Rivera was a disaster that only strengthened the prosecution's case. Doctor, isn't it true that you have a personal relationship with Nurse O'Sullivan that might affect your professional judgment? Mr. Morrison, I have professional respect for Nurse O'Sullivan based on 40 years of exemplary medical service. That respect is based on her competence, not personal bias. But doesn't your relationship create potential conflict of interest? Mr. Morrison, if respecting competent medical professionals constitutes conflict of interest, then every doctor and nurse in this county has a conflict of interest in supporting accurate medical documentation. The jury's reaction to Morrison's attack on medical professionals was clearly negative, with several members exchanging looks that suggested they found his strategy offensive rather than convincing. Sarah Mitchell's testimony about Derek's pattern of violence was devastating to the defense's portrayal of him as a good man who'd made a single mistake. Sarah, please describe what Derek Walsh did to you in November 2021. Derek hit me in the face with his fist during an argument about my job. When I fell, he kicked me in the ribs 3 times. I ended up in the emergency room with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and facial injuries that required reconstructive surgery. What happened when you tried to press charges? Derek's father offered me $50,000 to drop the charges and sign a non-disclosure agreement. His mother explained that testifying would destroy Derek's future and ruin my reputation in ways I couldn't imagine. And you accepted their offer? I was 23, scared, intimidated by expensive lawyers, and convinced that fighting the Walsh family would be more traumatic and expensive than taking their money and disappearing. Sarah, what motivated you to testify in this case? I realized that staying silent enabled Derek to escalate to attempted murder. If I'd been brave enough to testify 2 years ago, Emma wouldn't have nearly died on Christmas Eve. Morrison's cross-examination of Sarah was even more damaging to Derek's defense than his attack on medical professionals. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you accepted $50,000 from the Walsh family? Yes, I accepted money to stay silent about Derek's violence. And now you're testifying despite taking money to remain silent? Yes, because I understand now that taking money to cover up violence enables more violence. Couldn't your testimony be motivated by desire for attention or revenge? Mr. Morrison, if I wanted attention or revenge, I wouldn't have waited 2 years and moved to another city. I'm testifying because Derek Walsh is a dangerous man who nearly killed Emma, and someone needs to tell the truth about his pattern of violence. The jury's reaction to Morrison's attempt to portray Sarah as opportunistic was clearly negative, with several members looking disgusted by his implication that domestic violence victims who accepted settlements couldn't later testify truthfully about their experiences. I testified last, providing context about Derek's escalation and his family's intimidation tactics. Mrs. O'Sullivan, how did you learn about Derek's history of violence? Through my professional connections in the medical and law enforcement communities. When Derek began isolating Emma from family and friends, I started asking questions about his background. What did you discover? That Derek had a documented pattern of violence against women that his family had covered up through intimidation, bribery, and abuse of their wealth and influence. Mrs. O'Sullivan, have you experienced retaliation from the Walsh family for supporting Emma's case? They've filed false complaints against my medical credibility, threatened legal action, and attempted character assassination. But they've underestimated this community's commitment to justice and protection of domestic violence victims. Morrison's cross-examination of me was his final mistake. Mrs. O'Sullivan, aren't your actions motivated by personal vendetta against the Walsh family? Mr. Morrison, my actions are motivated by 40 years of treating domestic violence victims and understanding that wealthy abusers escalate when they believe their money makes them untouchable. But you admit to investigating my client's background before any alleged crime occurred. I admit to protecting my granddaughter from someone whose behavior suggested dangerous patterns. That investigation prevented Emma's murder, not caused her attempted murder. As the trial concluded, I realized that Derek's family had made every possible mistake in their defense strategy. They'd attacked medical professionals, intimidated witnesses, dismissed attempted murder as marital disagreement, and tried to portray victims as opportunistic liars, all of which had united the community against Derek and demonstrated exactly why his violence had escalated to attempted murder. Some families thought their wealth could purchase different rules of justice. Tomorrow, Derek Walsh would discover that some crimes were too serious and some evidence too overwhelming for money to overcome. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict that would reshape how domestic violence cases involving wealthy defendants were handled in our county. Derek sat at the defense table with the pale, hollow expression of a man who was finally understanding that his family's money couldn't eliminate medical evidence or silence determined witnesses. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hernandez asked. We have, Your Honor. I held Emma's hand as the jury foreman stood to read their decision, feeling her tension and my own 40 years of experience with justice systems that sometimes failed to protect the most vulnerable victims. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant Derek Walsh guilty. On the charge of aggravated domestic assault, we find the defendant Derek Walsh guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant Derek Walsh guilty. Emma's grip on my hand tightened as the verdicts were read, not with relief, but with something approaching disbelief that Derek was actually being held accountable, despite his family's wealth and influence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you for your service, Judge Hernandez said. Mr. Walsh, you'll be remanded into custody pending sentencing, which is scheduled for next Friday at 9 a.m. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, his family sat in stunned silence, apparently unable to process that their money and social influence had failed to protect him from consequences for attempted murder. William Walsh approached me in the courthouse hallway with an expression that mixed anger with what might have been grudging respect. Mrs. O'Sullivan, You've destroyed my son's life over what was essentially poor judgment during a marital disagreement. Mr. Walsh, Derek destroyed his own life when he escalated to attempted murder. I simply ensured that he faced appropriate consequences instead of being protected by your family's wealth. This conviction will ruin Derek's future. He'll lose his career, his reputation, everything he's worked for. Mr. Walsh, Emma nearly lost her life. Derek's career concerns are significantly less important than preventing him from murdering his next victim. You could have resolved this privately. Emma could have received compensation and counseling. Derek could have gotten help, and no one's life would have been destroyed. I looked at William Walsh, recognizing that he still didn't understand the difference between accountability and destruction, between consequences and injustice. Mr. Walsh, resolving attempted murder privately is called enabling criminal behavior. Derek needed criminal conviction, not family therapy and financial settlements. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I hope you're satisfied with the damage you've caused to our family's reputation. I'm satisfied that Derek won't be able to hurt other women, and that your family now understands that wealth doesn't provide exemption from accountability. Emma had been quiet during the exchange with William Walsh, but as we walked to my car, she finally spoke about what the conviction meant to her. Grandma Maggie, I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't found me on Christmas Eve. Emma, you don't need to think about that anymore. Derek is going to prison, and you're going to rebuild your life without fear of his violence. But what if his family had succeeded in covering this up? What if their money and influence had worked? Then Derek would have felt even more confident about escalating his violence, and some other woman would have died from his abuse. Grandma, how did you know that fighting the Walsh family would work? How did you know that their money wouldn't be enough to protect Derek? I thought about Emma's question as we drove through our small town, passing the hospital where I'd worked for 40 years, the police station where Chief Martinez had supported justice over influence, the courthouse where Judge Hernandez had prioritized evidence over wealth. Emma, I knew it would work because I understood that some communities have values that money can't corrupt, and that some evidence is too overwhelming for even the most expensive lawyers to eliminate. What happens now? Will Derek's family try to appeal or find other ways to avoid his prison sentence? They might try, but appeals require legal errors, not just unhappiness with verdicts. Derek was convicted based on overwhelming evidence and competent legal proceedings. And what about retaliation against us? Emma, the Walsh family's credibility in this community has been destroyed by their attempts to cover up attempted murder. Any retaliation would only confirm that they prioritize protecting criminals over supporting justice. The sentencing hearing brought a packed courtroom with domestic violence advocates, medical professionals, and community members who wanted to demonstrate that wealth wouldn't protect abusers from appropriate consequences. Judge Hernandez reviewed the evidence, Derek's criminal history, and victim impact statements before delivering a sentence that reflected the seriousness of attempted murder. Mr. Walsh, you deliberately endangered your wife's life by locking her outside in deadly cold weather during a moment of anger about perceived disrespect. Your actions could have resulted in her death, and they represent escalation in a pattern of violence against women. Furthermore, your family's attempts to cover up this crime through intimidation, character assassination, and abuse of wealth and influence demonstrate a complete lack of understanding about the seriousness of domestic violence. On the charge of attempted murder, you're sentenced to 7 years in state prison. On the charges of aggravated domestic assault and reckless endangerment, you're sentenced to an additional 3 years to run consecutively. Mr. Walsh, you'll serve a total of 10 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which you'll be prohibited from contacting the victim or her family. Derek's face went white as he absorbed the reality of spending a decade in prison for what his family had tried to characterize as a minor marital disagreement. Additionally, the court is ordering a permanent restraining order protecting Emma Walsh and all members of her family from any contact with Derek Walsh or his associates. As Derek was led away to begin his 10-year prison sentence, Emma and I met with District Attorney Santos to discuss the broader implications of the case. Michael, what impact do you think this conviction will have on future domestic violence cases involving wealthy defendants? Maggie, this case has established that medical evidence can't be eliminated through character assassination. That pattern evidence will be admitted regardless of family influence. And that witness intimidation will backfire spectacularly when communities unite to protect victims. And what about Derek's family's attempts to cover up his crimes? Their behavior has been so publicly documented that any future cover-up attempts will be immediately recognized as obstruction of justice. The Walsh family's credibility for protecting criminals has been permanently destroyed. That evening, Emma and I sat in my living room discussing her plans for rebuilding her life without fear of Derek's violence or his family's intimidation. Grandma Maggie, I want to go back to school to study social work. I want to help other women recognize abuse patterns and find courage to seek help. Emma, That sounds like a perfect way to transform your trauma into purpose and service. And I want to work specifically with cases involving wealthy abusers, because I understand now how money and influence can intimidate victims into staying silent. What have you learned about yourself through this experience? I've learned that surviving abuse requires more courage than I thought I had, and that standing up to powerful families is possible when you have people who refuse to let money override justice. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the journey from finding Emma dying of hypothermia on Christmas Eve to watching Derek begin a 10-year prison sentence for attempted murder. The war for Emma's justice had required confronting wealth, influence, character assassination, and intimidation tactics designed to protect a dangerous criminal from consequences. But it had also revealed that some communities would unite to protect victims, some institutions would prioritize evidence over influence, and some grandmothers had the determination to fight battles that money couldn't win. Derek Walsh had thought that humiliating an orphan would be consequence-free because she had no powerful family to protect her. He'd forgotten that some grandmothers were more powerful than all the money in the world, and that some communities valued justice more than wealth. Tomorrow, Emma would begin building a life dedicated to helping other women escape the kind of abuse she'd survived. Tonight, I would be grateful for the lesson that had taught an entire community that domestic violence was unacceptable regardless of the perpetrator's bank account. 5 years after Derek's conviction, I stood in the auditorium of the Regional Women's Center, watching Emma deliver the keynote address at the annual conference on domestic violence and financial abuse. She'd completed her master's degree in social work and had become one of the state's leading advocates for victims of wealthy abusers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma began, her voice carrying the authority that came from transforming personal trauma into professional expertise. 5 years ago, I was locked outside in deadly cold by a man who thought my orphan status made me powerless. Today, I want to share what I learned about fighting back when abusers have money and influence on their side. The audience, social workers, attorneys, law enforcement officers, and domestic violence survivors gave Emma their complete attention as she outlined the tactics wealthy families use to protect abusive members and the strategies that had proven effective in overcoming those advantages. The most dangerous assumption that abusers and their families make is that money can eliminate evidence, silence witnesses, and intimidate communities into accepting violence against vulnerable people. I felt pride watching Emma articulate insights that had taken years to develop, transforming the night she'd nearly died into education that could protect countless other women from similar dangers. What my grandmother taught me is that some communities have values that money can't corrupt, some evidence is too overwhelming for character assassination to eliminate, and some relationships are built on trust that can't be purchased or destroyed. After Emma's presentation, we joined the reception where she was approached by dozens of advocates, survivors, and professionals who wanted to learn more about challenging wealthy abusers and their enabling families. "Emma, your case has become a model for prosecutors handling domestic violence cases involving defendants with significant resources," said District Attorney Patricia Rodriguez from the state capitol. "The conviction rate for these cases has increased dramatically since your grandmother's strategy was documented and shared. What specifically has changed in how these cases are approached? We now systematically document pattern evidence, build coalitions of medical and community support, and prepare for intimidation tactics as standard prosecution strategy. Emma, your willingness to testify despite the Walsh family's wealth has inspired other victims to speak out against powerful abusers. And how has the legal community responded to tactics like the ones Derek's family used? Bar associations have implemented ethics training, specifically addressing attempts to intimidate witnesses and discredit medical evidence in domestic violence cases. Several attorneys have faced disciplinary action for using tactics similar to those used in Derek's defense. As the evening concluded, Emma and I drove through our town, passing the courthouse where Derek had been convicted, the hospital where I'd worked for 40 years, and the house where Emma had nearly died on Christmas Eve, but which now belonged to a young family with children who played safely in the yard. Grandma Maggie, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Derek's family had succeeded in covering up his attempted murder? I think Derek would have escalated to actual murder within a year or two, and his family would have found ways to cover that up too. What about other wealthy families with abusive members? Do you think Derek's conviction changed how they approach these situations? I think it established that money can't eliminate medical evidence, that intimidation tactics backfire when communities unite, and that some crimes are too serious for family influence to overcome. Grandma, I received an interesting call today. William Walsh wants to meet with us. I felt surprised by Emma's news. Derek's father had maintained bitter silence since the conviction, apparently unable to accept that his son was serving a 10-year prison sentence for crimes his family had tried to portray as minor disagreements. What does William want to discuss? He says he has information about Derek that we should know, and that he wants to apologize for his family's behavior during the trial. Emma, are you interested in hearing what he has to say? I'm curious about what's motivated this change after 5 years of silence. The next morning, William Walsh arrived at my house looking significantly older and less confident than the man who'd tried to intimidate us during Derek's prosecution. He carried himself with the subdued manner of someone who'd learned expensive lessons about the limitations of wealth and influence. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Emma, thank you for agreeing to see me. William, what brings you here after 5 years? I need to apologize for my family's behavior during Derek's trial, and I need to share information that might prevent other families from experiencing what we've all gone through. William sat heavily in my living room chair, looking like a man who'd spent years processing the reality of his son's crimes and his own role in enabling them. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Derek attempted suicide in prison last month. Emma's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while I felt a mixture of concern and vindication that Derek was finally experiencing consequences that his family's money couldn't eliminate. Is he all right? He's alive, but the incident forced me to confront some truths about Derek's behavior that I'd been avoiding. Mrs. O'Sullivan, during his psychological evaluation, Derek admitted to planning Emma's murder and making it look like an accident. I felt cold fury settle in my chest as I realized that Derek's Christmas Eve abuse had been even more calculated and dangerous than we'd understood during the trial. What kind of plan? Derek intended to leave Emma outside long enough to die from hypothermia, then claim that she'd gone outside voluntarily during an argument and that he'd been too intoxicated to realize she was in danger. William, are you saying that Derek deliberately tried to murder Emma? Yes, and Mrs. O'Sullivan, I need you to understand that my family's attempts to cover up his crimes nearly enabled premeditated murder. Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing the recognition that Derek's violence had been even more calculated than the attempted murder conviction had established. Mr. Walsh, what changed your perspective about Derek's case? Watching Derek in prison forced me to accept that my son is a dangerous criminal whose violence would have escalated regardless of how much money and influence my family used to protect him. And what about your family's attempts to intimidate us and cover up his crimes? I'm profoundly ashamed of our behavior. Mrs. O'Sullivan, we prioritized protecting Derek's reputation over Emma's life, and we used wealth and influence in ways that nearly enabled murder. William, what do you want from us now? I want to donate $1 million to the domestic violence center where Emma works, and I want to publicly acknowledge that my family's behavior was wrong. Why now? Because Derek's suicide attempt made me realize that enabling criminal behavior doesn't protect anyone. It just creates more victims and more pain. As William Walsh left my house with a commitment to support domestic violence programs rather than cover up domestic violence crimes, I realized that Derek's conviction had created changes that extended far beyond his individual punishment. Emma, what do you think about William's transformation? I think guilt and prison visits have taught him lessons that money and influence never could. And what about Derek's admission that he planned to murder you? It confirms what we always suspected, that Christmas Eve wasn't poor judgment or anger management. It was calculated attempted murder by someone who thought wealth made him untouchable. That evening, as Emma and I planned the expansion of domestic violence programs that would be funded by the Walsh family's guilt and recognition, I reflected on the journey from finding Emma dying in the snow to building systems that would protect other women from similar dangers. Derek thought that humiliating an orphan would be consequence-free because she had no powerful family to protect her. He forgot that some grandmothers were worth entire armies, and that some communities would unite to prove that money couldn't purchase the right to commit attempted murder. But most importantly, he learned that some orphans become the strongest advocates for other vulnerable people when they survive the worst that wealth and cruelty can inflict. The war for Emma's justice had ended with Derek serving a 10-year prison sentence and his family funding programs to prevent the kind of violence they'd once tried to cover up. But the real victory was Emma's transformation from victim to advocate, helping other women recognize that survival was possible even when abusers had all the money and influence in the world. Some battles for justice required confronting wealth, intimidation, and character assassination. But when communities united to protect vulnerable people, when institutions prioritized evidence over influence, and when grandmothers refused to let money override love, even the most powerful families learned that some crimes couldn't be covered up and some victims couldn't be silenced. Derek Walsh had declared war on the wrong family, and Emma and I had proven that love, determination, and community support were more powerful than all the money in the world. The end.